I'd like to thank IDEA for giving us this opportunity to talk about the Global Citizenship Certificate, and myself and my colleague, Dr. Aoife Titley, to give you a taster of what the course actually operates on. So I'll start off just a quick outline of the certificate itself. It was the brainchild of Dr. Eilish Dillon in the International Development Department, and she worked then with 5 different departments to bring this course to fruition. And it's a 1-year postgraduate, a level 9 certificate designed specifically for educators working at all levels, be it early education, youth, schools, adult and community. And the outcomes behind it are to allow participants a chance to critically review some of the key global development challenges that we face, to give them a chance to share and enhance their own pedagogical skills around global citizenship education, and ultimately to build their confidence in being able to facilitate discussions with their peers and their core groups around these related issues. So there's 5 departments looking after this course, each providing facilitators. International Development, where I'm from, FREBL, Department of Primary and Early Childhood Education, the Department of Education, Adult and Community, and the Department of Applied Social Sciences. So we all have a fairly long history in working around global citizenship education and delivering global citizenship education. My own module is KD637. It's a core module and it's titled Contemporary Global Development Issues, Challenges and Responses. And I'm going to give you a little taster of what I cover in that. So Lizzy asked, how are you feeling? I suppose, how are we all feeling? Not specifically right now, but in general, with life and all the challenges around that. And if there's a lovely line that I came across in a Twitter feed, that sometimes it feels like we're living in kind of a disaster movie with multiple plot lines, be it around climate change, conflict, kind of the reassertion of geopolitics, kind of very aggressive geopolitics, and the development now of AI technologies, which even challenge our eyes in terms of what we can see and what's true and what's not. So the UNDP in a 2022 report kind of captured some of that zeitgeist when they talked about kind of the development of the new normal being insecurity, which they said was a confluence of destabilizing planetary pressures, an awareness of growing inequality, societal transformation, and the kind of widespread polarization. And this has created this new kind of series of interacting sources of uncertainty that everybody is feeling. Achim Steiner, the head of the UNDP, kind of captured it nicely when he talked about, how people around the world are now telling us that they feel ever more insecure, the strain of polarization, political extremism and demagoguery, all being supercharged by social media, artificial intelligence, and other powerful technologies. Adam Tooze, the German historian, has kind of captured that multi-layering of crises by reinvigorating the word, the polycrisis, a multi-crisis that's intertwined, creating compounding effects. And the Cascade Institute, for instance, described that as kind of the causal entanglement of multiple global systems that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. So this feeling that we have of being overwhelmed, Tooze said, welcome to the club, or welcome to the age of the polycrisis. He said, if you're feeling confused and everything's impacting upon you, it's not personal, it's not private, it happens to be a collective experience. The WEF kind of categorized a series of different systems that we have kind of that are overlapping and impacting upon each other: environmental, economic, geopolitical, societal, and technological. And every year they do kind of an assessment of these risks where they ask over 1,600 different experts around what they regard as being the top risks for 2 years and 10 years. And as you can see, for the next 10 years, climate change dominates that. Over 5 of the top 10 are climate change related. And second in that is around technological developments. So how do we deal with this polycrisis? Tooze draws his inspiration from John Maynard Keynes, an economist of the early 20th century, who he describes as being the method theorist who can deal with complexity and entangled problems and failed political coordination. And for Keynes, he said, what we need to do is recognize we have a packed agenda and try and take the technical solvable problems off that agenda to provide some space to deal with the more difficult political issues that we need to tackle. the ones where there's least political agreement on. And Tu says this is, he would see this as being a good model for thinking about the current moment. His parting shot is that the polycrisis is the new normal and we shouldn't get too worked up, relax, he said. This is the condition of our current moment. So I'd like to look at climate change in the European Union, and in particular the European Green Deal as a policy response to one of this very significant driver of change and transition. So the European Green Deal has been described as Europe's moonshot. So the challenge that Europe has set itself is to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It's got 3 essential pillars: promoting green energy to remove greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, to decouple away from resource use by the provision of a circular economy and restore the biodiversity in nature, and then a just transition process which underpins that. That recognizes that this sort of transition process is going to impact on particular regions and particular industries and particular individuals, and we need to have an equity focus to make sure that everybody is brought along and not impacted negatively by these sort of changes. It's a lot of money being put into it, close to €1 trillion. A lot of money coming from a large proportion of the EU's next EU 7-year budget is focused specifically around the EU Green Deal. So one aspect of that, the first pillar we talked about, was green energy and trying to decarbonize the energy system. And just to recognize the challenge around that. You're not talking about decarbonizing the electricity system. You're talking about all different sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture, building, heating, transport, all of these have to be addressed when we talk about decarbonisation. As a vision, it's revolutionary in a way. It requires kind of a massive redeployment of deployment of renewable energy, complete removal of coal and gas, and this will bring about major changes in our transport systems, in our food systems, in our buildings, factories, how we manage waste, etc. Despite that, and there would be a lot of criticism of the European Green Deal as being a fairly tepid response to the challenge of climate change, we can see already how fractious this process has become and how polarizing it's become with the change. We see, industry, the farming community, conservative politicians. There's kind of a growing backlash amongst those different cohort groups around kind of the process, the excessive burdens, the regulations that are being brought in. So what's the issue? Well, it's systems change. And when we talk about systems, they're about our behaviors, about our expectations, and systems change is really, really challenging. It's a lot of uncertainty around it. There's a lot of unpredictability around it and a lot of change in the very nature. So, that cartoon there, everybody wants change, but who wants to actually change? And if we look at the Green Deal itself and look at it as a form of socio-technical change, and we look at one aspect of that, for instance, the move to renewables, we can see there are technical issues with switching over to renewables, issues around intermittency and curtailment, either too little power or too much power at the wrong time. And we can have technical solutions to that. We can expand the grid, we can develop interconnectors, develop storage systems, new batteries, hydrogen as an energy carrier, electric vehicles, etc. So the technical responses are possible there. But the big challenge are around kind of the politics and the social challenges of rolling out renewable systems. We still have people who disbelieve that we need to bring about this sort of change. We've got cohorts of people who want to see change, but not where it affects them in their own particular backyard. We've got issues around the cost burdens, where are they going to fall? Who are going to pay for them? We've got issues around the burden sharing. And then we're bringing about change within an already congested, bureaucratic, heavy regulated sector that in many cases is not really up to the sort of change and the speed that's actually required. So it's not so much the technical challenges, though they are there, but it's almost the politics and the social challenges of rolling out this sort of change that has proven to be very problematic. So the polycrisis requires systemic transition. It's about change that's transformative, that's cross-cutting, that's fundamental, that impacts in terms of the technologies we use, our social practices, our norms, our expectations, our governance systems. And that's what makes it so challenging. So on the good news, in terms of climate change, are people engaged? There was a very interesting report from Nature Climate Change there in 2024, And there was a big survey of 125 countries, nearly 130,000 people, and very positive news coming out of that, where like nearly 70% of those that were surveyed expressed a willingness to contribute 1% of their income towards climate action. Nearly 90% felt that there was a demand for much more intensive action from the politicians around addressing climate change and introducing pro-climate policy. Here in Ireland, the EPA has released a 2024 report, which again mirrors a lot of those findings there. It looks at the Irish public's attitude towards climate change. And over 87% of people there that were surveyed responded very positively, recognizing the responsibility that we have as Irish citizens to climate change, to acting on climate change, and to trying to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. So transition is needed. I think transition is recognized, but the issue is the contestation around what form it actually takes. So we recognize the need to decouple our economic growth from materials and greenhouse gases. We recognize a need to address the environmental and biodiversity challenges. We recognize a need to address the equity issues with transition, both legacy and contemporary. And we recognize that these changes are going to be systematic in nature, but it's what we actually change is where the contestation lies. There's still fundamental disagreement around economic growth, whether we can have economic growth in the future, whether that can be sustainable, how much we can dematerialize our economic growth systems, how viable are the alternatives, for instance, of post-growth or degrowth, what impact will they have in terms of employment and income generation. We've got contestation around the equity issues, which countries should change and how much change should they invoke, when should they change, how should they change, and even within societies themselves around the transition policies, who should be compensated, who should pay for that, and how much should they actually pay. And then around capitalism itself and the sustainability of capitalism going forward. I suppose ultimately around the vision of what our societies should be after a transition process. But change is coming, particularly around green power and circular economies. The Chinese have had their policy platform of circular economy since 2020. We've talked about the European Green Deal, and the United States has its Inflation Reduction Act. So all of these are pushing for transition towards kind of decarbonising the energy systems and introducing circular economies. The UNDP's latest report, I suppose, is very frustrated about the lack of sort of change that we've seen. We still have runaway climate change despite all the talk. We've got rising populism. We've got cascading human rights violations and massacres of unconscionable, as they say, massacres of people in Ukraine and in Gaza. And yet we're living in a time of unprecedented wealth and know-how and technological capacity. So why aren't we bringing about that sort of change? Why are we stuck? Like even the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the kind of pushing forward on the Paris Agreement seems to have hit a quagmire. One of the things that comes out of that report very strongly is that sense of how the poly crisis has impacted on people in creating a sense of disempowerment and a loss of hope. And the World Values Survey, which is quoted in that report, is very depressing in that it talks about how over half of those surveyed, half the global population, don't feel in control of their lives. Over 1/3 of people believe that their voice is actually heard within the political system. So over 2/3 of people feel disenfranchised. And that's a major issue if we want to bring about the sort of transitions that we actually need. The title of their report is Reimagining Cooperation in a Polarized. The fact that even if we're deglobalizing, we can't deplanetize. And they've got some positive statements around, the need to re-envisage and reinvigorate global public goods for the 21st century, much more transfers from rich countries to poor countries to advance the goals that we all face as a community of nations. The need to dial down, as they talk about temperatures and pushing back on polarization, to create positive pressures around building empathy, creating interpersonal trust, and emphasizing our shared identities rather than our differences. And finally, the need to re-engineer our institutions, political institutions in particular, to make them much more people-centered and future-orientated. The EEA, the European Economic Agency, has, which is, I suppose, a think tank in Europe, which provides information and advice to the European Commission and the European Parliament. They have a major piece on kind of sustainability transitions and the importance of inclusion of people within those processes. These transitions are fundamental and transformative. They're going to impact all of our ways of life. And it's, as they say there, it's really, really important when we consider questions of distributive and procedural justice to ensure that we've got the full creative potential and involvement of all sectors of society, especially citizens. In terms of sustainability transformations, public participation is very important. It unleashes creativity, generates knowledge, can mobilize agency, give people a feeling of hope and participation in change, and act as a channel for environmental and social concerns to be debated and expressed and hopefully to be resolved. So these processes, whatever form they take, substantially and fundamentally require public participation and informed participation in these sort of processes. And how do we go about doing that? How do we create those conditions for empowering citizens and building effective forms of public participation in the transition process? I think global citizenship education has a very strong role to play in that sort of process. So I'll finish on that.
My name is Aoife Titley. I am the lecturer in GCE in the Frebel department in Maynooth University. So I work with student primary teachers in, I suppose, all of the adjectival education. So human rights education, education for sustainable development, intercultural education, development education, anti-racism education, which we do sort of under the umbrella of global citizenship education. So all the fun stuff. And as I said, it's brilliant to see so many people here today from such a variety of different organisations, and it's great that people weren't tempted by the kind of constant coverage of the new Taoiseach and all the cabinet speculation. So I'm sure we could be in for a new minister later on in the afternoon. So very interesting times ahead for all of us. But before I get into, I suppose, the content and the specific details of my module, just as a kind of a starting point, I thought it might be important to acknowledge that I suppose a lot of learners arrive at their engagement with global citizenship education kind of from quite an ethnocentric place, if we're honest. So it's kind of inevitable and kind of understandable at times even that people take European superiority for granted, because that's the lens through which we view things. That's what we're bombarded with in the media. And as a result, we can often believe that our viewpoint is the best. So sometimes the influences of our personal and our cultural experiences can be a little bit neo-colonialist in outlook, or we might be motivated by paternalistic or charitable notions, as opposed to coming from maybe a more justice or more solidarity perspective. So it's very important, I suppose, as a starting point, to really think about how you can deconstruct events and issues from a range of different viewpoints in order to develop what Doug Bourne calls a kind of a global outlook or a global mindset, which kind of takes in, the views and the perspectives of others. So really across the certificate, and I suppose particularly then in the module that I'll be talking to you about, there is a real emphasis on, critical reflection, on positionality, and I suppose really creating a space to explore our own ethnic identity in particular, and how that impacts the lens through which we view the world, and how that impacts the type of approach that we take to our GCE work, whatever type of educator that we might be. So I'm obviously, working in the primary education sector, and I'll be talking about teachers in just a minute, but I really wanted to emphasize that the certificate is really not about teachers just in the formal sense. It's really open to anyone that has an interest or commitment to global citizenship education. But at the same time, it would be remiss, I suppose, not to acknowledge, the demographics of teachers, and I suppose the part that plays in shaping the approach that we often take to global justice issues in the classroom. So just in relation, I suppose, to the context that I work in primary education, we know, I suppose, that, across primary schools in the country, there's a lot of rich diversity in our classrooms. with children coming from a range of different ethnic and mixed heritage backgrounds. But we also know that, that rich diversity that's in our pupil population is not mirrored in the demographics of the teachers that stand in front of them. And we know from the literature and from the research that teachers in Ireland tend to be overwhelmingly white, female, settled, Catholic, and middle class. And we know, I suppose, from statistical research carried out by colleagues in NUIG that teachers in Ireland are 99.7% white. Okay, so that's quite a stark statistic, and it might be jarring for, a lot of people to hear. And that would be 99.7% in comparison to about 85% of the general population that would identify as white and Irish. So whatever way you look at it, there is that big kind of demographic divide or kind of an ethnic mismatch in relation to the educators that we have. So obviously, I'm talking about formal education there, but I think we know anecdotally that's also true of the GCE sector as well. I suppose if we do put ourselves under the lens, we also know that there would be a majority of white people or people coming from the cultural majority who would be involved in the design and delivery of GCE programs within the Irish sector. We also know traditionally, I suppose, that a lot of migrant-led organisations who were found it very challenging to source funding or found it very difficult to retain funding as well. So I think those are things that we need to acknowledge as a sector. Those are conversations that we need to have, and those are things that we really need to keep on the agenda as well. Going back, I suppose, to educators then in the formal sense, it's also interesting to note that I suppose in addition to the ethnic side of things, teachers in general tend to be much more socially advantaged, particularly student teachers. So, student teachers entering into initial teacher education programs in university tend to be much more socially advantaged than students entering into other programs within, similar universities as well. So in practice, that might mean that they're less likely to have gone to a DEIS school, they're less likely to be in receipt of a higher education grant, or they're just less likely to have come to college through some sort of alternative pathway. They also would self-identify that they have very little exposure to diversity as well. So a high percentage of student teachers and teachers would say, they've never met an asylum seeker, they've never had a conversation with a traveller. So these are all of the things that we need to be bearing in mind when it comes to looking at global justice issues, and particularly stuff around race or racism and anti-racism. So just to speak a little bit more specifically then about the module that I'll be involved in on the cert, which will be one of 4 elective modules that you can choose from. So you can see there, I suppose, we'll be looking at a lot of what I would call in some ways very standard global education topics in relation to refugees, migration and asylum. We're having a focus on what we would call international service learning, which is, I suppose, the more polite term for what could also be known as voluntourism. So when people from Western countries spend protracted periods, maybe teaching or working in an overseas community as well. And I suppose everything that we'd look at in the module would also have that very important GCE focus of making those local global links in terms of interdependence and opportunities for solidarity as well. But the main focus, I suppose, of this module, which I suppose makes it a little bit different in terms of other GCE offerings, is it would have a very big focus on anti-racism and understanding race and racism and how they play out in the context of GCE as well. So part of how we would do that is obviously through, as I said, critical reflection and positionality, really looking at the attitudes, the experiences, the outlooks that we bring as educators to our work, and the frame through which we are predisposed as well. It's very much connected to a values-led approach, as you know, development education, global citizenship education, very much values-led educations. I'll talk a little bit more about the logistics of the course, but obviously, there are significant hours involved, in the inputs, but rest assured it won't be just about listening to people. As you can imagine, if it's a GCE program, it's going to be very non-didactic. So within the module, we'll be using a lot of democratic, creative, active, and very dialogic methodologies as well. And again, I suppose modeling certain methodology, young people or adult learners or working in formal education can then also bring them into their practice as well. Very importantly for, I suppose, a module focusing in on anti-racism, I'll be working with a range of really amazing guest lecturers from a range of minoritized inputs who will give, I suppose, certain perspectives and come at topics from particular vantage points as well. So the module is called Decolonizing the Curriculum. And again, even though it's focusing on curriculum it's not necessarily in the formal sense. It's really just looking at decolonizing or unpacking or unlearning some of the assumptions that we have and how we can maybe come at our teaching or our facilitation in a different perspective. So as I mentioned earlier, certainly in the Irish context, it would be very unusual for educators or students or anyone involved in any aspect of teaching and learning to be given space to explore or to unpack or to even understand their own ethnic identity, or indeed even the opportunity to study, what race is, what racism is, how they are constructed in society, and how they might manifest themselves in our lived experiences and in the lived experiences of minoritized ethnic people as well. So by way of centering this, and I suppose by trying to choose the most relevant and appropriate theory to support the learning in the module, the conceptual framework that will underpin our work in this decolonising the curriculum is that of critical race theory. So I don't know how familiar people are with critical race theory. I think it's admittedly very, very underutilised in the Irish context. Also, I would say very misunderstood in the Irish context and very misunderstood in the international context as well. So just felt using this might be a good opportunity to bring something new into GCE and to kind of familiarise ourselves with it so that we could see its kind of resonance and relevance to application in the GCE context. I want to use the time I have just to maybe share a little bit about the logistics of the course and more specifics about it. But again, just to mention, I suppose, that it's quite interesting that CRT, which in some ways is a relatively marginal academic theory, but it has become such big news, particularly in America in the last couple of years. It's become very much a kind of a bogeyman for everything that's wrong, with the woke, or with the left, or with snowflakes, or whatever, however way you want to understand it. But again, how it's been appropriated and how it's been, I suppose, taken over by the far right is something that people should be fearful of, and how it's really, kind of misunderstood and misrepresented in that sense as well. So needless to say, within the module, we'll go into greater detail around the history of CRT and what the values are, and explain, I suppose, its potential value and application, and what the value of bringing a CRT lens to GCE can take on as well. But just in terms of, I suppose, of its application in relation to GCE, there is no real specific definition of critical race theory, which again, I suppose, can contribute to how it can be misunderstood, how it can be perceived as a little bit woolly or maybe a little bit overly theoretical. So Delgado and Stefanczyk, they talk that rather than give a definition or an explanation of what CRT is, it makes more sense to talk about basic insights. And generally, there would be considered to be kind of 6 main tenets of critical race theory. Again, I'm not going to go into all of them today, but just to focus on 1 or 2, which I think would be very relevant for global educators. So in terms of the first one there, like, CRT would encourage us to acknowledge and to identify the fact that racism should be viewed as endemic within society. I think in Irish education, there is a tendency to still have a very superficial understanding of what racism is, and to conceive of it as something, that's merely prejudice that happens at an interpersonal level, and not to acknowledge, I suppose, the systemic nature of racism and how racism can permeate through organizational structures and systems within society as well. So Derek Bell, who was one of the founders of CRT, he would say that, racism should be seen as should be considered as a permanent fixture, both in the lives of minoritized ethnic people, but also in relation to, as I said, how it permeates through structures in societies. So really, I suppose when I think about that, I think about how systems within our society are set up to privilege some people at the expense of others and deprivilege others. And I think that that's very relevant to global education topics that we would be looking at, particularly at the moment. I'd be thinking of, I suppose, the asylum crisis, and I suppose how the system of direct provision is set up within Irish society, and how, certain groups, even within the asylum seeker group, are privileged at the expense of other people as well. The second tenet there, just around centering stories and counter storytelling. I suppose CRT has long insisted on the power of what it calls, the counter story or the counter narrative, because it argues that people in positions of power, particularly in stratified societies, which we all live in, tend to be the ones that get to tell the stories or get to make the decisions and have the power. So the idea of the counter story in critical race theory is that it's necessarily positioned outside of this, and it's designed instead to challenge what is known as a stock story or a majoritarian story. So these are kind of stock stories that society tells about a certain phenomenon. So CRT would argue that those stock stories that explain like how our society is structured and how we live and how we have set up the world and how the world works, that they need to be challenged by more diverse stories or more oppositional stories, which can really then help to illuminate how systems work and how processes in society work. So again, very reminiscent of the importance of what we would all talk about as GCE educators in relation to multiple perspectives and seeing things, you know, from different vantage points and things like that. So again, I suppose in another thing that would have great relevance for global education is that CRT is an academic, you know, discipline and academic theory, but at its heart, it's also really a very impressive form of activism as well, and would fight towards, I suppose, a more socially just and, you know, forwarding a social justice agenda within society. So, CRT, I suppose, is centering race, it's centering criticality, it's centering reflection, it's centering positionality, it's centering stories, and it's centering action. But all of this is relevant, and I suppose all of this enhances our practice as global educators by learning more about race and racism and why we need to include them in conversations about global justice issues. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think we can chat about it maybe in the discussion. But really, when we look back at the colonial project, it's very hard to divorce conceptions of racial hierarchy and white supremacy that were at the heart of it and that were central to the colonial mission. And a lot of people would argue to a lot of neo-colonial options at the moment, which are also very evident in certain development projects and in certain development approaches. So really, I suppose, remembering where we're coming from in terms of cultural majority and how that lens can often be very powerful, and we have to be, I suppose, unlearn it and be conscious of it when we are, I suppose, delivering GCE in a variety of different contexts. So I just wanted to finish with a quick quote there from Chinua Achebe, as you know, who's a Nigerian poet and writer. And again, talking really very much about the complexity of colonization and about how those notions of superiority, of supremacy are central to the colonial mission. So it's quite a long quote. I might just give people a second just there to read it yourself, because I think it really hits to the heart of how conceptions of race and racial hierarchy play into discourse around development as well. So again, great resonance in terms of, I suppose, really centering values, really challenging, you know, dehumanizing language that can happen, you know, in development contexts and in the context of racism as well, and really foregrounding, I suppose, that idea of empathy and humanity and solidarity as well. Just to give you a flavour, I suppose, of what we will be looking at in the decolonising the curriculum module. And I wanted to go on then just to give you a couple of more specific bits of information about this certificate. So I'm sure a lot of you are here at the moment because you are considering maybe ongoing professional learning and maybe a pathway into further education, into some kind of opportunity next year. So needless to say, you know, we would love to have you in Maynooth. I'm not just saying this, but Maynooth is genuinely a lovely campus. The 5 departments that are involved in this certificate are really amazing educators. More importantly, all of the lecturers are really approachable, really accessible, and it's very much about building that relationship between the lecturers and the learning, and I suppose creating a collaborative and a space, safe learning space for everyone as well. So the certificate that we are offering, it's going to run again next year for the academic year 2024-2025. It's a 1-year commitment, so you'll be starting towards the end of September, and then generally the assessments will be finished up maybe by around the 2nd week of May, maybe 3rd week of May, depending on the module. So not quite the full year, but the full academic year. It's part-time, so it's designed to support anyone who is already working, and as a result, the lectures tend to be in the evening or at the weekends as well, just to support people in terms of accessing them. It's level 9, so it's a postgraduate certificate, and you receive 20 credits for completion of the certificate. And that's relevant because, you know, people might be considering this as a pathway to further study, and I know that there are master's programs within some of the departments in Maynooth that then will recognise some of the credits that you have done on the GCE certificate. So again, that could be an appealing option for people that might be wanting to do a master's in the future or might want to continue on their study within Maynooth University. So it's not the case in all departments, but again, we'll be able to communicate with you what other master's programs are available to you if you decide to complete the cert. So as I said, you know, I might have been focusing a little bit on formal education, but really it's open to anyone who has a commitment and a passion for global education working in any kind of context. And to be honest, that was the real beauty of the cert last year, was that we were in learning spaces with people that were coming from lots of diverse perspectives, working with adults, working with young people, working with, you know, school students, but outside of the formal education sector, and you know, working in a real interesting mix of places. So it was very much that everybody was on the learning journey and everybody was learning from each other and their context as we went along as well. Just in terms of the practicalities, the closing date for applications will be the 20th of June. Between ourselves, there might be a little bit of flexibility about that date, but maybe we'll stop the recording for that bit just in case I get into trouble. But again, it's only April now, so there's plenty of time for people to be thinking ahead as to whether or not it will suit them. Plenty of time for people to be working on the application, thinking about, you know, what type of modules you might want to take, what you would like to get out of it. And again, if there's any issues with that deadline, please just get in touch with myself or Patrick or Tom, who's the coordinator, whose details that I'll share. And again, in terms of the practicalities, you apply through PAC, which is the kind of postgraduate online form. I think it stands for processing applications in the cloud or something like that, but I better check that before you quote me on it. So that's the link there for the postgraduate courses in Maynooth University. As I mentioned, the lectures are designed to support people who are in employment. So they tend to be in the evenings or at the weekends. For example, my module, we decided was 3 full Saturdays, kind of 9 to 5, to really immerse ourselves in the context, just to build that relationship with the class and to provide space to, you know, really reflect and have a little bit of time between sessions as well. My module was all in person. That was a decision that I made, I suppose, from having been a bit zoomed out, but also because of the sensitivity of some of the topics that we'd be talking about. I think it would be very hard for people to discuss some of those topics if we weren't face to face and weren't kind of feeling comfortable in each other's presence. I think one of the electives is exclusively online. So again, that might suit people depending on their situation. And then a lot of the modules then have some sort of hybrid component to it as well. So there might be 1 or 2 lectures online, and then you might come on campus for a Saturday half day or something like that. And again, going back to the evaluations, the face-to-face stuff was very, very valued by the participants in the certificate the first year around, in terms of having the opportunity to get to know the campus, avail of the library, get to know people in the class, and just have that, I suppose, university experience as well. Just to talk about the not so nice side of things there, which are the fees for the programme. So for next year, it is €1,600. And then there's also an additional student levy that goes to Maynooth for registration of €150. I should mention as well, for people planning ahead, if you apply through PAC, there is also a small fee of €50 to process your application as well. So that is all stuff you need to take into account when you're thinking ahead and budgeting. I would say that it's great news that there could be potentially bursaries available depending on what sector you're coming from. So if you're working in the adult or community sector, there might be funding available through CELTA. Worldwide Global Schools have very kindly agreed that post-primary teachers can use some of their funding towards their registration as well. We're exploring additional funding for primary teachers through Irish Aid and through DICE. So what I would say is that I know that not everyone will have access to funding for CPD through their organisation. So if funding is, you know, one of the main reasons that you would think about not doing it, or you would see it as being a potential barrier to you, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to, you know, again, myself or Tom, who is the coordinator. His details are there, because there are opportunities for support and are opportunities for bursaries that we'd be happy to talk through with you. And then there's just some of the practical links there. Tom is the coordinator. He's in Patrick's department in international development and is an amazing coordinator and extremely helpful with any questions you might have about your particular situation or how it might work for you. And then that's the link there with all of the breakdown of the credits, the breakdown of the information, who's teaching the course, and the module descriptors as well. So I'll send these slides on. I think Elaine has them anyway. But if you just Google certificate in global citizenship education, the link comes up immediately. And then finally, I suppose, just to talk a little bit about the programme structure. So as Patrick said earlier, there's one compulsory module that Patrick coordinates and delivers that you get 10 credits for. And then the idea is then you would choose 2 elective modules for which you get 5 credits each. So you'll be doing 3 modules over the course of the year. So it might not seem like a lot, but as you can imagine, coming up to assessment time, or like in the second semester when you'll be doing 2 modules, it is something that you would notice, having to make space for within already busy lives. So Patrick's module is the compulsory one there. He's given you a very comprehensive outline of that. And again, going back to the evaluations, this was met very, very positively by students. So, across the board, they said that this module was a really essential kind of, I suppose, foundation through which then they could use to apply the learning to the electives then that ran in the second semester. So you do 1 compulsory module in the first semester, and then you choose 2 out of the 4 electives for the second semester as well. So the first one there is the one that I'll be delivering, and I spoke to you about decolonising the curriculum, and that will be hosted by the Frabble department in Maynooth University. The second one then is community work and youth work practice, local issues, global lens, and that's facilitated by Marianne O'Shea in the Department of Applied Social Studies. The next elective there is called Sharing the World, Education, Pluralism and Conflict, and that's delivered by the Department of Education in Maynooth, who work with post-primary teachers. That has quite a philosophical component to it. It's delivered by some of the philosophy team in the education department. And again, I suppose a big focus on criticality in that as well. The final one then is Critical Reflections on Global Citizenship Education Practice, and that's facilitated by the Department of Adult and Community Education in Maynooth. And again, very much a critical, reflective component to it. So very introspective module, very critically reflective, and again, utilising a lot of, I suppose, creative and innovative assessment methods as well. So thank you.